Psychology of Spirituality. I'm sitting here in my office, which is located in the corner of the library, where I'm finishing my year as a school psychology intern at Hempstead Middle School. Hempstead is a town of about 7,000 people located about an hour and a half from Houston city limits. So I'm creating this video to touch on a few key topics. Number one, what do school psychologists do? Number two, utilizing a preventative approach to adolescent mental health. You can even say child mental health. Number three, what are some takeaways we can glean from having a more systematic approach to mental health and the infrastructure of mental health in our society, in our nation, and in the world globally? Number one, what do school psychologists do? A lot of this is dependent on the actual school that you work in and the school district that you work in. School districts operate very autonomously, so there are national guidelines for what a school psychologist should be doing, but depending on where you work, there's a amount of flexibility you may have. For example, when I worked at Galena Park ISD, I was doing lots of assessments because a diagnostician, which is it's another profession tasked with doing assessments on students. So if you think about special education, right, diagnosing a student with intellectual disability or with dyslexia or with some sort of learning impairment, that's usually done by a diagnostician or a school psychologist or an LSSP. So an LSSP is a master's level school psychologist, whereas I'm in a PhD program, which would mean that when I graduate with a PhD, I have the flexibility to work at a hospital, at a private clinic, and a school also. So testing is one of the main things that we do, right? In a school, psychology is usually used as a means towards some ends, right? The ends being better academic performance, right? We want students to achieve educationally, and of course, as I've talked about on this channel, right, a degree of educational attainment is one of the strongest predictors of life outcome success, so that's very important, right? So we identify students, maybe that's through a referral process, maybe that's through an MTSS process, and I'm putting more descriptions, information in the description for you to broaden your knowledge on some of these terms that I'm using. Students are identified through some sort of process. Maybe they're having lots of social emotional difficulties, right? Something we would call an emotional disturbance that requires them to receive special education services, right?
So much, go ahead. Shoot it. Come on, shoot. You got these people up here thinking you retarded. Your ass gonna end up in them sped classes. Now whip. Nay, nay. Come on. Hey, hey, hey. Hit it. Hit it. If you don't start using your common sense and acting right, these white people, they're going to kill you.
Ms. Reed.
Kill you. Now do the worm.
Really, there's no need
Let's
for that.
see it.
There's no need for that.
You up here showing out for your white classmates? Yeah, you laughing with them now, but they're going to be the only ones laughing when you dead or in jail.
I wasn't even trying to show
I don't want to hear it.
What's your problem?
Now get to class. And I better not get another call from this school.
I'll walk him back.
Special education can also be behavioral supports, right? Like in this school, we have PASS support. So, if a student is getting aggravated, having lots of interpersonal conflicts with teachers and students, they're allowed to have a pull-out where they go into a self-contained classroom for a period or a day or a week, and in the hopes that in this more structured classroom where they're allowed to have one-on-one support, where they're provided some social emotional training, right, that they're able to, when they're back in the general classroom setting, they have some skills in place, so they're better able to adapt with situations that might occur, right? So identifying students, giving them assessments, and then trying to figure out what their eligibility is, right? We have emotional disturbance, we have intellectual disability, we have autism, we have other health impairment, ADHD, which is probably the main criteria used for special education services, right? That's one main thing that we're doing, right? Number two, counseling as a related service, right? There is a school counselor present, but for those of you, we're not really sure what the school counselor does. I'm not trying to undermine the position, right? I have a really good relationship with the school counselor here, and I try to involve him as much as I can in some of the psychological service delivery that we do. But because we get more enhanced training on mental health, one of the main things that I try to utilize, because I'm given a lot more autonomy. I'm the only psychologist working at this middle school, which has about 600 students, right? So I have more leeway in what I want to do. Although, if I get a referral from a couple of teachers and I have to do an assessment, then you have to do the assessment, right? But because we have diagnosticians here, I'm only doing the psychological piece. I'm not doing the cognitive, intellectual piece, right? Which you can think about more like formal IQ testing, right? I'm doing more of what's the psychological history, what are the behaviors which may be driving negative interactions with the teacher, why is there any sort of underlying mental health symptoms which may be causing impaired performance in the classroom, right? I'm answering more of those questions. So counseling is something that I try to build in, right? Because giving students that one-on-one support is very vital to me. And I've been in this school long enough that, I've kind of become Mr. Popular over here, and I've started doing a lot more group-based therapy, right? So students will come into this office or another bigger office that we have. We'll do some sort of team building exercise, right? Last week I had them build Legos together, right? A lot of these kids have poor social skills, right? And that can be something as small as inappropriateness, right? They don't know how to talk well, which is important for 13, 14-year-olds to develop that skill, right? Because they're young adults in some sense, right? And some of the other students have autism, which is one of the symptoms of autism is that impaired social reciprocity, right? So if we do some sort of group-based exercise, right? Maybe some kids struggle with aggression, right? So we'll do some sort of like therapeutic-based CBT exercise on the rights and wrongs of, utilizing anger in different situations, right? So we'll do role modeling, right? Hypothetical situations, right? And the great thing about being in a school as opposed to a private clinic, right, is you get to observe students in their natural setting, right? You get to see the skills that you learn in real time when they're interacting with teachers and students, right? This is a natural environment, which is one great advantage of being in a school, is that you're not a mental health professional removed from their life, right? They're not just visiting you once every 2 weeks on some far corner of the city, right? You live and exist within this community. You interact with the parents, you interact with the teachers, right? In best cases, and it's different for me. I drive here 1 hour from where I live, right? In a utopian world, right? In a town of 7,000 people, the psychologist should be part of the community, right? And, I talk a lot about indigenous psychology on this channel, but if we're utilizing that spiritual approach, right? The healer in any indigenous community is part of the social fabric of that community, right? That's very important to be seen as that member of the tribe, so to speak, right? And through interpersonal development, you can reach that level, right? That's another very critical part of working as a psychologist in a school, right? You have so many different relationships you have to function, well, right? The assistant principals, the teachers, right? The administrators, right? The special education department, the kids themselves, right? I mean, that's probably the most important one. Each kid has a different temperament, a different personality, different educational demands, different IEPs, individualized educational plans, right? And it can get overwhelming at times because of the demand of mental health services needed in a school, right? And just to summarize a little bit more about what school psychologists do before I move into needing the necessity of having a preventative approach to child, adolescent mental health, right? So assessments are very important. Counseling, consultation is also very important too, right? You try to pass psychology forward, right? You try to teach teachers or teach administrators some sort of psychological implementation, right? Whether that's through a behavioral framework. I would say the dominant psychological modality in a school is the behavioralist orientation. I was trained primarily through behavioralist orientation, right? And on my website, I have an entire tab where you can download resources on behavioralism, right? And there's a lot of criticisms that people have towards behavioralism, right? Because of its deep ties with the military-industrial complex, and its development in our history and its utilization towards controlling people, like Project MK Ultra, for example, right? Trying to predict human behavior, right? Psychologists being like these demigods trying to like control people's their environment so that they can operate how they live, right?
My father and my stepmother decided to put me in the Allen Memorial Institute. They had no idea what went on in there. I was 16 when I was there.
Dr. Cameron pursued a concept he called depatterning, which was meant to reduce patients to an infantile psychological state wherein doctors could take advantage of the person's cognitive vulnerability to attempt to rebuild their mind under the doctor's control.
There's a wider conversation to be had on the existential concerns of working in any institution, right? There's lots of subconscious and conscious, questions that come up, is trying to change this student's temperament so that he can fit the mold of a perfect student, the status quo of a student. Is that appropriate here, right? So you can't be the corporate man, right? You can't speak as the administrative mouthpiece of the institution that you work for all the time, right? People wear this hat called, that says "soul not for sale," right? That's something that I try to keep as a mantra, kind of, right? Is that you need to have a level of individuality, a level of looking out past the box of the administrative red tape and the bureaucratic, laborious nature of any institution which demands compliance, right? For example, right, there are students here who are very inappropriate, for example, right? These kids get referred all the time because, they're class clowns, they act out a lot, they talk back to the teachers, right? So many teachers get fed up and they're like, okay, I want this kid out of my classroom. Give him an emotional disturbance, eligibility, put him in special education, right?
That's it. Simple. Anybody can do. -2 plus 2 equals. Nethead. Orale. Answer it. Come on, you know the answer. -2 plus 2, fill the hole. You can do it. You don't let these burros laugh at you. -2 plus 2 equals. I'll break your neck like a toothpick. Orale.
0.
0. You're right. Simple. That's it. -2 plus 2 equals 0. You just fill the hole.
Those type of situations where there may be a disgruntled teacher who is pushing for an evaluation when you feel like there may not be any sort of psychological impairment happening, right? Those type of things happen a lot, which is why consultation is very important, right? You can provide some other service delivery without the student being labeled with oppositional defiant disorder, for example, right? Because it may not fit, right? The student may just be funny, right? He definitely inappropriate. That happens here all the time, right? But it's not so severe that it's like debilitating their entire life, right? So I use a very strict criteria for these different mental health symptoms, right? These different mental health diagnoses, because these are important labels, right? So assessment, so trying to figure out whether the student fits in special education criteria, or if not that, some sort of 504 supports, and I'm putting information on what 504 is, and counseling therapy, including group therapy, and then consultation, right? Many school psychologists also work at an administrative level, right? For example, this school district, Hempstead, they have not had any sort of inbuilt psychological foundation for the previous 10 to 20 years, right? They've outsourced their psychologist from Uvalde County, which is the adjacent school county, right? Dr. Harvey, who I work under, was a psychologist who worked in Houston who decided to move to this school district and create an entire psychological service delivery, right? So that means this school district now has school psychologists who work under Hempstead ISD, not for Waller ISD, and they just come here to do assessments twice a week and then go back, right? Which requires lots of logistical, practical work, right? Trying to figure out the correct referral system, trying to figure out some tier 1 interventions to put into place. For example, this year they did a bullying prevention program, right? The counselor, myself, the assistant principals went into the classrooms and delivered this bullying intervention to all of the students, right? We call that a tier 1 intervention, in the hopes that through this program, the students are able to build some interpersonal, social, emotional, hopefully spiritual skills that will curb or prevent future bullying instances from taking place, right?
You wrote that, Julian?
Yes, sir.
He showed us these other notes that your son left in his locker and his desk, chair.
Okay, look, if no one else is going to have the courage to say it, then I guess I will. These kids are too young to be dealing with this sort of thing. Julian has had nightmares because of that kid.
Sarah.
Did you know that? We had to take him to a child psychologist to help him deal with his night terrors.
It's just a 2-day suspension. You'll stay home from the nature preserve trip. That's all.
2 days for a couple of notes from a kid.
Collecting data is very important too, right? It's one of the important parts of having a school psychologist, because we're trained more on methodological or research development, whereas a master's level, they don't get as much experience in that, right? So tracking the incidence of bullying in this case, right? And seeing whether this intervention that we did in the beginning of the year, whether it had any sort of intended impact, and if it didn't, going back to the drawing board, seeing what other sort of modifications we can put going forward into the next year, right? So that type of administrative work is also one of the advantages of working as a school psychologist, right? Because we're not solely working at a one-on-one level, and there's only so much work we can do at a one-on-one level, right? I mean, the demands of mental health services in this country are daunting, right? So we need to have some sort of infrastructure in place, which is why my second topic is having a preventative approach to mental health, right? There's a great quote by Frederick Douglass where he says, "It's easier to build stronger children than to repair broken men," right? And working with students, working with 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds, right, gives you that ability in entrenching, instilling those psychological, spiritual, emotional, cognitive, behavioral variables that you hope generalize into their life when they grow older, right? Yesterday there was a tragic shooting that occurred in Uvalde, Texas, about 400 miles from here, right? That town has many parallels to where I live right now, right? A small school district, low-resourced, primarily minorities, right? So as psychologists who work in a school, trying to identify students who need some sort of connection, some sort of hope, some sort of optimism, some sort of person championing for them goes a very long way, right? So it isn't just this technical, rigorous procedure of identifying students, doing a report, giving them services. I mean, if we remove all of those, technical verbiage, the task that's assigned for me is to connect really with students, right?
Are you okay?
Hey, can I take a look at this?
Does anybody know about this photo? Let me rephrase. Who doesn't know about this photo? Seriously?
That's really what we're doing, right? And you can do that through a number of different models, right? You can do that in a group setting. You can do that through check-ins. You can do that through actual counseling. You can do that by, via the parents, via the teachers, right? But having a positive school climate is ultimately what we're aiming for, because we know from research that school engagement and students having a degree of motivation for school and identifying with the school, right? Those are protective factors, right? And we hope to be one part of that preventative approach, right? Instilling in them a belief that, they can become the engineer of tomorrow, become the, musician of tomorrow, becoming the artist of tomorrow, giving them transition goals, helping them concretely enact the skills needed for them to become the citizens of tomorrow, right? Because that's what they are. These 13-year-olds will be the people driving on our roads 10 years from now, right? The people working or, going to college to work 10 years from now, right? So one of the main motivators that I have in working with youth and adolescents, especially in a school, is to be one part of that puzzle, right? Whether that's even just through doing some sort of inventory on who they see themselves to be in a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. That's one of the main exercises that I do, right? Especially at this age, right? Many 13-year-olds, many of these kids want to be NBA players. Many of them want to be rappers. Many of them want to be like fashion icons, for example, right? And my job isn't to like shoot that down and tell them, oh no, have more realistic goals. It's to paint for them how complex that might be and the development that they can enact for them to get closer to that goal, right? And maybe through that journey, they'll find other strands, other doors they may want to go through, right? So I do SMART goals, right? And I'm listing the SMART goals right here. And through a process of working with them for a year, we see whether they're getting closer to that goal, right? If they want to become a basketball player, we speak about teamwork, right? Teamwork requires a level of social skills. That's a very technical term, right? It requires a degree of selflessness, right? It requires a degree of sacrifice, of humility, right? All the great athletes of our time, and I'm big into like mixed martial arts philosophy, right? Humility, right? Sports is a great way to instill humility, right?
And we have to respect the game.
That's right. Respect.
Yo, coach, how many more I got?
When I work with kids in this setting, I really try to give them that approach of looking at their life more holistically, right? I always ask them about spirituality, right? What are their deeper values for a life worth living? Where they draw their inspiration and their strength from, right? So all of these go into the process of preventative mental health, right? And there are many other things that we can do as a society to enact a more preventative framework, right? Both at an individual level and at a systems level, right? From funding towards having more concrete development of programs in schools and in communities, right? Having an interdisciplinary approach is very important, right? If we take this school district, right, this town of 7,000 people, as a microcosmic example for the many other millions of other societies in our world, right? We have a local healthcare infrastructure, right? We have a local school, we have a local religious congregation, right? Which work each very independently. There's some crossover, but very minimally, right? I think one of the most important things going forward is to have a much more comprehensive interdisciplinary bridge between these autonomous agencies, right? The religious congregation here, and we're in Texas, we're in a small district, primarily Hispanic, African American, very highly religious, right? Most of the kids that I talk to, when I ask them where they draw their support from, the number one answer I get is from God or family, right? Right. So as a psychologist tasked with instilling hope, resilience, social emotional skills, right? Many of those values and goals are commensurate, or they align themselves well with what a religious congregation is also trying to do, right? And we have many coaches here Even the behavioral support teacher at the high school is also the youth minister at the local Baptist church here, right? And he does a great job of, instilling in these kids, some level of social consciousness, right? And having them think for the future them, right? The future me, the future you, right? So our tasks align with each other, right? It may seem like, okay, we're psychologists, we're scientists, we're researchers, those are spiritual leaders. There's no overlap between us. But again, once you destroy those artificial boundaries and segmentations we've put on our minds and in our societies, right? You'll see much more convergence between these different dimensions of humanity, right? Seriously,